Beneath Lake Michigan and the ranges surrounding it sits one of the largest iron ore deposits on the planet. Billions of tons of it, pure enough to be smelted with technology that should not have existed for thousands of years. But the deeper researchers dig into the soil around these old mines, the stranger the story gets. Massive open pits stretching for hundreds of miles, vertical shafts that drop 40 feet into solid bedrock. Evidence that someone was pulling iron and copper out of this land for over 12,000 years, and not a single pickaxe was ever found. If you want to see more lost histories the textbooks refuse to teach, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New investigations drop every week, and the next one might be the one they try to bury. Now let me show you what they actually found up there. The land around Lake Michigan and Lake Superior holds something the mainstream history books treat as a footnote. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the Iron Range of Minnesota, the Penache Range of Wisconsin. Together they form one of the richest iron and copper provinces on Earth. Geologists call this region the Lake Superior Iron District, and the official story is simple. American settlers discovered the ore in the 1840s. Railroad companies built lines into the wilderness. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and Cleveland fed on that ore. The United States became an industrial power because of what came out of those hills. That is the version you learned in school. The problem is that when the first surveyors arrived in the 1840s, the mines were already there. In 1847, a man named Samuel Knapp was prospecting near Ontonagon, Michigan. He noticed a strange depression in the ground covered in moss. When his crew cleared it out, they found a pit, a perfectly squared-off shaft cut into solid rock. At the bottom sat a 5-ton mass of pure copper, raised up on a platform of oak logs and stones, as if someone had been preparing to lift it out and then suddenly stopped. The oak was carbon dated more than a century later. The trees had been cut down at least 3,500 years before Knapp ever walked into that forest. This was not an isolated find. Once miners knew what to look for, the pits started appearing everywhere. The old copper complex, archaeologists eventually called it. Thousands of workings stretching from Isle Royale down through the Keweenaw Peninsula and across the Upper Peninsula. Some were shallow trenches, others were vertical shafts driven straight down through rock that takes modern diamond drills to penetrate. Estimates of how much copper was removed from these mines range from 500,000 tons to over £1.5 billion. For comparison, that is more copper than the entire Bronze Age civilization of the Mediterranean is believed to have used. One pit alone, on Isle Royale in the middle of Lake Superior, produced more raw copper than every native settlement in the Great Lakes region combined could have ever used in 5,000 years. Another near Macargo Cove ran for nearly 2 miles in a continuous trench, with the rock wall showing the marks of repeated fire setting and water quenching. To open that pit by hand with stone hammers would have required a workforce of thousands operating continuously for generations. There is no archaeological village anywhere near it large enough to have housed those workers. So a question started forming around the campfires of the men who worked those ranges. Where did all of that copper go? Because here is the part that does not fit. Indigenous tribes living in the region when Europeans arrived had copper tools, beautiful ones in some cases, knives, spear points, fish hooks, ornaments. But the volume of copper found in native settlements across North America accounts for a tiny fraction of what was removed from those Lake Superior mines. The math is not even close. Almost all of the copper simply vanished. Then the story got stranger. In the 1870s, as steel demand exploded after the Civil War, surveyors started pushing into the iron ranges south and east of the copper country. The Marquette Range, the Menominee Range, the Gugabik Range. Up in Minnesota, the Vermilion Range, and later, the Great Mesabi. They found something that the official histories rarely talk about. Old workings, iron pits that had been opened, worked and abandoned long before any Europeans set foot on the continent. In some cases, the trenches were filled with topsoil 6 to 10 feet deep. Trees 300 years old were growing out of the spoil heaps. When men cleared the debris, they found tunnels driven into hematite seams. They found smelting hearths. They found slag, the glassy waste material that only comes from refining ore at high temperatures. And nowhere, in all of this evidence of massive industrial extraction, did they find the tools. A pickaxe is not a delicate object. It is a steel head on a wooden handle. The handle rots, the head does not. Iron and stone tools survive for thousands of years in the cold, acidic soils of the upper Midwest. Archaeologists have pulled spear points out of those bogs that are 9,000 years old. They have recovered birch bark scrolls. They have recovered wooden artifacts from before the pyramids were built. But across the entire Lake Superior mining district, the tally of confirmed mining tools comes out to roughly 10,000 hammerstones, round rocks, pieces of granite and basalt with grooves chipped into them so they could be tied to wooden handles. That is the official answer. But then the ore was removed by ancient peoples beating on rock faces with handheld stones, possibly heated by fire and cracked with cold water. Try to picture that for a moment. Try to picture a workforce extracting 500 million pounds of metal from solid bedrock using nothing but rocks tied to sticks for 12,000 years. With no written language, no draft animals, no metallurgy beyond cold hammering, and somehow leaving behind smelting slag from a process they were not supposed to know. It does not add up. The numbers do not add up, and the technology does not add up either. So researchers outside the mainstream began asking a different question. What if the people who originally opened those mines were not the same people who were living there when the Europeans arrived? This is where the Tartaria question enters the story. Across Russia, Central Asia, parts of China, and stretching west all the way to the Atlantic, old maps show a vast civilization that mainstream historians say never existed in the form depicted. The maps call it Tartaria, or Great Tartary. They show it on documents printed in Amsterdam, in London, in Paris. The Encyclopaedia Britannica described it in detail in its 1771 edition. By the late 1800s, the name had quietly disappeared from textbooks. The official explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire, just a vague European term for the steppe peoples. That is the version you find in academic journals today. But the people researching the iron and copper mines of the Great Lakes started noticing something. The dates kept overlapping with the supposed peak of this lost civilization. The disappearance of the missing copper kept lining up with eras when transcontinental trade was supposedly impossible. The architecture of certain old structures across the upper Midwest, structures that mainstream archaeology shrugs off as colonial farmhouses, kept featuring details that looked nothing like frontier carpentry. And then there was the iron itself. When metallurgists analysed samples of slag pulled from those old hearths in the Upper Peninsula, they found something unexpected. Some of it had been refined at temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The chemical signatures showed deliberate alloying. This was not bog iron being banged into a knife by a guy at a campfire. This was industrial metallurgy. Industrial metallurgy that, according to the timeline taught in schools, would not exist in North America for another 1,000 years after this slag was deposited. So researchers started asking the unwelcome question. If the natives the Europeans met had no memory of who mined that ore, and the Europeans did not mine it, and the archaeological tool record cannot account for the scale of extraction, then who was working those mines? A few patterns started showing up. First, the mines align with old shipping routes. Lake Superior is, geologically speaking, a perfect waterway. A ship leaving the Keweenaw could reach the St. Lawrence, the Atlantic, and from there anywhere in the world. Ore moved by water has always been cheaper than ore moved by land. Someone with ocean-going ships and a global trading network could have run those mines for centuries without ever building a city in Michigan, because the city did not need to be in Michigan. The product was the iron. The people who refined it lived somewhere else. Second, the working stopped suddenly. Across multiple sites, dated samples show production continuing for thousands of years and then ending almost overnight, around the same window. Different researchers give different dates, but the ban keeps falling somewhere between 1300 and 1600 AD. Whatever was running those mines stopped running them, and stopped fast. Third, when the Jesuits and the early French explorers showed up in the 1600s, the tribes they encountered had stories. The Ojibwe spoke of a race of red-haired men who had come from across the water and taken the metal. The Menominee had legends of underground people who had built the pits and then vanished. The Lakota described a great war that had ended an older world. These were not folk tales invented to entertain anthropologists. These were accounts the tribes shared reluctantly, often only after pressure from missionaries. Fourth, the chemical fingerprint of Lake Superior copper started turning up in unexpected places. Bronze artifacts pulled from sites in the eastern Mediterranean, from the British Isles, from Scandinavia. Studies of trace lead and silver isotopes in some of these objects match the unique signature of cubine or copper rather than any known European or Asian source. Mainstream archaeology calls these results contaminated samples and contested findings. The researchers who ran the tests stand by them. Either way, the fact that the question even has to be asked tells you the official map of ancient trade routes is missing something. All of it gets brushed off. The tribal accounts get called mythology. The isotope studies get called contamination. The missing tonnage gets called an overestimate. The smelting hearths get called Victorian-era forges that nobody can name. But folklore that lines up with carbon dating, slag analysis and missing tonnage is no longer just folklore. It is testimony. It is an oral and physical record from people who saw the tail end of something the official story refuses to acknowledge. Now, the question almost answers itself. If you are running an industrial extraction operation across an ocean, why would your tools be on site? You would bring them in by ship and take them home with you. The same way oil companies today fly equipment in and out of remote fields. The same way mining corporations strip a region and leave nothing behind but the pits. That is exactly what the Lake Superior workings look like. They look like a stripped industrial site, picked clean, with the residue of refining left behind because slag is too heavy to bother moving. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They were not learning. They were not experimenting. They came in with a plan, ran the operation for thousands of years, and left when the supply was tapped or when something elsewhere collapsed and the ships stopped coming. Then there is the question of the iron itself, the deposits that filled the mills of Pittsburgh. The Lake Superior iron formations are some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet. The hematite is rich, accessible, and stretches across thousands of square miles. By the 1870s, every major American steel company was sending boats up the Soo Locks to load ore. By 1900, the Mesabi alone was producing more iron than the rest of the world combined. The United States became an industrial superpower on the strength of this single mineral province. But the steelmakers who built the modern railroads, the skyscrapers and the warships were not the first to discover those deposits. They were the second wave. The first wave had already drilled the test shafts, mapped the seams, and left the slag heaps cooling in the forest. The American industrialists walked into a region that had already been industrially surveyed, and they did not say a word about who had done the surveying. Because saying it would have meant rewriting everything. It would have meant admitting that the timeline taught in classrooms had a gap in it, a gap large enough to fit an entire civilization. A civilization that ran ships across the Atlantic before Columbus, that processed metals at temperatures Europeans could not match until the late 1700s, that mined a region the size of California, and then disappeared so completely that the only thing left of them was the holes in the ground. This is the part the Tartaria researchers keep returning to, not because they have proof of every claim. They do not, and the honest ones admit it. But because the mainstream story has gaps, you can drive a freighter through. 500 million pounds of missing copper, hundreds of square miles of unexplained workings, smelting evidence that predates the supposed invention of smelting in the region by 1,000 years. Native oral histories that describe a vanished people. Old maps that show a civilization the encyclopedia later erased. You can dismiss any one of those things on its own. You can argue with the dating, argue with the legends, argue with the maps, but all of them together, all pointing at the same era, all centered on the same Great Lakes basin, becomes harder to wave away. Something was here, something big, something that left iron and copper flowing out of these lakes for 12,000 years, and did not leave a single pickaxe behind. Because the people running the operation were not primitive, they were technological, and whatever ended their world ended it so completely that the only memory we have of them today is the empty pits they left in the bedrock. The next time someone tells you that history began when the Europeans arrived in the 1500s, ask them where the copper went. Then ask them where the tools are. Then watch them change the subject.